Welcome, everybody. I think we'll get started. And of course, to all of those coming in, you are very welcome. We're happy to see you here. Thanks very much for joining us as we discuss the reverberations of October 7th, and especially, of course, the horrific violence that has been ongoing since and on, of course, October 7th. My name is Cliona Rowley. I'm the president and founder of ACLED, and I will be your moderator today. I have the great pleasure of introducing a number of our analysts and researchers here at ACLED who will be guiding us through the local, the national, the regional, and the international ramifications and, of course, reverberations of what's been occurring in Gaza. And before I do, I want to kind of set the scene before I pass it to Nasser Khadour, who will be talking about the situation in Gaza, the Palestinian armed groups. From then, it will go to Amina Mehvar, who will be talking about settler violence trends, in particular in the West Bank, and of course, what's happening within Lebanon. And then I will be passing it to Luca Nebola, who will be pointing out how the Houthi movement in Yemen has really accelerated their activity since this point. And Kieran Doyle, who is our US manager, who's been overseeing our US crisis monitor, which again has been overwhelmed with the number of pro-Palestinian protests within that context now for a few months. And I will give a very brief discussion about African jihadi movements and their reaction to October 7th. But while we do, I'm going to pass to the first slide, which will discuss for us really some of the more, as I mentioned, regional ramifications of what's happening with since October 7th. Gaza was a global event, despite the fact that, of course, the area itself is quite small. After the attacks on October 7th, what we've seen is that this conflict can have international ramifications, and that's quite unique. Very few conflicts manage to have such an outsized effect. And that's in part, of course, because it has engaged and ignited quite a lot of the antagonisms that are felt around Israel, regionally and internationally. In fact, what we'll find is that those antagonisms, much more so than the antagonisms that may be generating jihadi activity, especially lone wolf jihadi activity, is what's pushed the size of this conflict to be absolutely massive compared to its locality. And in particular, what we will discuss is, what's happening locally and subnationally in Gaza from Hamas is that there's been a move away from political movements and a focus on devastating conflict. And of course, Hamas is one of many Palestinian groups, and tactical ambitions of that group have meant that there's been a reshuffling and a realignment of activity within that context. There, of course, is ramifications in the West Bank, which Amina will speak to, and Israeli society at large. We've seen a lot of legal, political, and economic changes as a result of this response to October 7th. So, of course, this intersects with both regional and international scales. And as I mentioned, many people, in fact, there was some confirmation of this, felt that this would enliven what was a declining jihadi general movement. And while we certainly see heightened activity, especially heightened international activity from actors such as the Houthis, we've of course seen activity in Syria and Iraq as a result or directly contributing to the idea that Gaza itself has enlivened some of these antagonisms. What we can generally say, of course, is that the jihadi movements have very different reactions to Hamas, very different reactions to the fight that Hamas espouses against Israel. And whereas Al-Qaeda, for example, congratulated Hamas for its activity, ISIS, who seems to be involved in a general purity contest with all other jihadi groups, did not. ISIS does not prioritize or center Israel in its own activity. And what we can see is that while they've tried to take the opportunity to encourage lone wolf attacks, especially in the West, this has not necessarily had a large-scale influence as they hoped it would, and its decline continues. But I really do want to reiterate that the dominant reaction of the world to what's been happening within Gaza has been through and with Israel at the center. Whether it is US support for Israel, or of course, Iran's continuing attempts to dismantle Israel influence in the region, that has really been the center of where we are with international reactions. And I, of course, will be able to explain how this has had other reverberations with nationalist groups that have a jihadi ambition. And Kieran, for example, will take a much different route, looking at how during this year where there's quite a lot of electoral campaigns, a lot of the positioning of this conflict comes down to how it matters for domestic politics in the countries we speak about. And that is extremely important in the US, especially at the moment. So let me take this opportunity now to pass to Nasser, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Klina. Hi, everyone. I'm Nasser Khdour, Palestine researcher, and I'm going to talk about the operation in Gaza with focusing on key trends since October 7. The Gaza war is one of the deadliest current conflicts, with more fatalities per duration than other conflicts in the world, such as the conflicts in Sudan and Ukraine. And so far, we have recorded more than 37,500 reported Palestinian fatalities. But due to the reporting limitations, this figure should include both civilians and fighters. Israel estimates that more than 15,000 of those who were killed are combatants. This visual shows the remote violence, which is airstrikes and shelling committed by the Israeli forces since October 7. This type of violence constituted about 80% of the entire political violence in Gaza Strip since October 7. And as you can see, the number of fatalities per day, the blue line, has decreased over time, despite the number of events per time still relatively high. One explanation is that the number of aerial or shelling events that targeted civilians and civilian infrastructure, as you can see in the dark orange area, have gradually decreased over time. Also, during the past 3 months, we have seen an increase in reported drone and helicopter attacks compared to the beginning of the war, in which Israel were heavily using fighter jets and big bombs. Next, please. This visual shows the Palestinian armed groups involved in Gaza war since October 7. So in addition to Hamas, which has been the de facto government since 2007, there are 9 other armed groups engaged in the current conflicts, with Hamas, of course, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad have been the most influential actors in the battle against the IDF. And all these groups constitute different mainstreams of the Palestinian national movement. For example, Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, the Mujahideen brigades, and also Salah ad-Din brigades are Islamist group with Sunni ideology. Al-Aqsa Brigade also is affiliated with Fatah, which is a secular movement, but they don't have a direct relation with the official leadership of Fatah. Other groups such as the PFLP and DFLP are communist in ideology, and they are part of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Next slide, please. This figure represents the political violence by the Gaza armed groups. The orange line represents the events of battle or exchange of fire with the IDF, while the blue line shows the trend of remote violence and explosions. You can see that the frequency of the battles and armed clashes peaked during the operation in Gaza City, and after the end of Khan Yunis operation in April 7, this trend has begun to decrease. Then it rose again with the start of Rafah operation. You can see also that the explosion and remote violence events, the blue line, showed a more consistent pattern compared to the battle events. But during the Rafah ground operation, the Palestinian groups seems that they are favoring more remote violence tactics over the direct confrontation with the IDF, comparing to the previous ground operations in Gaza City and Khan Yunis. So in majority of the political violence events, the armed groups used unguided anti-tank missiles, sniping attacks, explosion traps, and mortars and short-range missiles. Next, please. For the current IDF operation in Rafah, this is an updated map that we have published in our initial briefing about the operation. Now, almost 8 weeks passed since the IDF began its operation in Rafah. And the Palestinian fatalities, for example, since the start of the operation is nearly 750 Palestinians, with Israeli forces stating that more than 500 gunmen were killed during the operation. And actually, this is the lowest number of the fatalities compared to the Gaza City and Khan Yunis invasion. Also, the Israeli forces have captured the entire Philadelphia corridor along the border with Egypt, including the Rafah crossing border, which is the only Palestinian crossing border. And this means that Hamas has lost actually a source of funding and an area of smuggling the weapons. We have also recorded property destruction events in areas marked with orange dots. Some of these destructions, of course, were tunnels and facilities belonging to Hamas and other armed groups, while the majority were also the destruction of civilians, building and structures, including the Rafah crossing border. Also, the Israeli forces actually achieved operational control over the entire eastern part of Rafah, including Yabna camp. And currently, there is an ongoing fight west of Rafah, especially in Tal Sultan, and in the center of Rafah, especially in Rafah refugee camp. The last thing about Rafah, actually, we have recorded at least 24 Israeli fatalities during the ground operation, and those fatalities were killed mainly in sniping, anti-tank missiles, and traps and explosion incidents. Next, please. For the future political violence trend after Rafah, and in case a ceasefire deal between Hamas and Israel hasn't reached, it seems that the violence in Gaza Strip will continue. So Israeli forces will likely continue their operation through low-intensity activities where the IDF could carry out pinpoint airstrikes and raid. If we look just at the Gaza City as an example, you can see here that the IDF has ended his ground operation or initial ground operation in Gaza City by early January, and says that they achieved operational control and defeated Hamas battalions in Gaza City. But since that time, the Israeli forces have been conducting daily airstrikes and regular also pinpoint raids. So it seems that Hamas has managed to reorganize itself again and again, and it is still capable to fight everywhere in Gaza City until this moment. And finally, the Palestinian factions will likely keep focusing also on remote violence attacks, and especially firing mortars on Netzarim axis and Philadelphia corridor, in addition to the other guerrilla warfare tactics. Thank you, and I will stop here and hand over to Aminai. She will talk about the West Bank and the Lebanon front.
Thank you very much, Nasser, and hello, everyone. So I'm going to start by speaking about the situation in the West Bank, where a significant decline in security has been observed since October, with some pre-existing trends drastically intensifying. Next, please. One important trend we have analyzed in detail and highlighted in a study we published last month is the escalation of settler violence, particularly by armed settlers. Over the past few years, there was already a steady rise in settler violence in the West Bank, but what has changed is that since last October, we have observed settler acting increasingly in organized ways and using firearms. In the last 9 months, there has been over 200 armed incidents, leading to at least 10 fatalities among Palestinians. Many of these incidents took place in the presence of the IDF. In at least 5 other cases, both settlers and soldiers fired at the same time, so it was unclear who fired the fatal shots. Next, please. We have also seen an increase in violence involving settler security squads, often wearing uniforms which that make them hard to distinguish from soldiers. These squads, who are volunteers that are trained and armed by the IDF, have existed for decades as the first line of defense for settlements. But after Hamas's attack, they increasingly engaged in violence against civilians in the West Bank, in many cases in areas where shepherding communities have been displaced. For example, in Hebron, you can see a few cases now on the map. Next, please. Lastly, also armed settler soldiers have engaged in various acts of violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. Quantifying this incidence is not always easy because the involvement of specific IDF units is often not reported. But the IDF mobilized over 5,000 reservist settler soldiers to protect the West Bank, to protect the settlements in the West Bank last October. And around the same time, also violence by soldiers targeting Palestinian civilians surged to an all-time high in the ACLED data. Next, please. Now, in addition to settler violence, a significant factor contributing to the unrest in the West Bank has been the resurgence of Palestinian armed groups over the past 2.5 to 3 years. Before that, such activity had been largely absent from the region for more than 15 years. We covered this development in the period before October 7th in a study we published last December. In the interest of time, I'll just now very briefly highlight that since October, the activity of these groups has intensified even further. Despite extensive IDF crackdowns, including prolonged operations with heavy weapons and airstrikes, this wave of armed activity has not been suppressed yet. Next, please. Now, these groups range from Hamas operatives to more locally organized groups that either self-identify or are in one way or another linked to PIJ and Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, groups that have been on the forefront of the violent escalation in the West Bank. There are also some groups who maintain to be independent. Over half of these groups' activities have occurred during IDF raids and operations, but there has also been a notable increase in offensive actions, including attacks on soldiers, checkpoints, and military posts, as well as shootings towards settlements and Israeli towns beyond the Green Line, though there have been few casualties. Next, please. Geographically, these armed groups are particularly active in the northern West Bank, especially around refugee camps like Jenin and Tulkarm, where Palestinian armed groups have traditionally had a strong foothold. But their activity is not limited to these areas. And one final point to note, many of these groups who have emerged locally in the context of grievances related to settler violence, occupation and intensified IDF raids, or dissatisfaction with the PA, likely lack the resources to buy expensive smuggled weapons or to manage complex smuggling operations on their own. So it is more plausible that more powerful actors like the PIJ, Hamas, and the Iranian backers are funding and supplying weapons to most of these groups aiming to fuel the armed resistance in the West Bank. Given also other important recent developments, including the IDF quietly handing over significant legal powers in the West Bank to the ministry under the authority of far-right Smotrich, himself a settler, we expect the heightened level of violence in the West Bank to continue for some time to come, also beyond the end of fighting in Gaza. Next, please. Now, moving beyond the West Bank, IDF forces have also engaged in near daily cross-border fire with Lebanese Hezbollah along Israel's northern border since October 8th. Over 7,000 combined attacks have been recorded so far, though the intensity of the fire exchanges has fluctuated. There has been a general understanding that neither side has really wanted a full-scale war, with Israel trying to avoid a second front while fighting intensively in Gaza, and Hezbollah understanding that most Lebanese do not want a war that would make Lebanon's economic problems worse at this time. Also, Hezbollah's ally and supporter, Iran, has shown no appetite for a major escalation that could deplete Hezbollah's arsenal and risk weakening its key asset in the region. Next, please. So while Hezbollah has kept Israel busy in the north, the hostilities have been kept below a certain threshold. This means violence has been largely confined to border areas, and extensive civilian casualties and infrastructure damage in both countries have been avoided. But in the absence of a ceasefire in Gaza, the conflict has gradually intensified. And both sides have increasingly targeted locations deeper inside each other's territories. Next, please. The most intense phase of escalation happened from May to around mid-June. After Israel's incursion into Rafah, Hezbollah intensified its attacks with new tactics and weapons, including missile-firing drones, advanced Falak 2 rockets, and air defense missiles targeting Israeli jets. Hezbollah also targeted cities that had not been evacuated. In June, Hezbollah also launched increasingly larger salvos of rockets that sparked extensive fires across northern Israel. Some of these, or you can see all the events that we have collected on this map. This increased domestic pressure on the Israeli government to show a more forceful response. Both sides also showed more aggression in their rhetoric, with the Israeli military suggesting it had approved and validated plans for a potential offensive into Lebanon. Next, please. Now, anticipating that fighting in Gaza would wind down after the Rafah operation, and that Israel could then redirect its efforts to the north. Hezbollah's latest move will also show of strength to establish deterrence. Nevertheless, the region seemed to get dangerously close to a broader war. After the Eid al-Adha Muslim festivities, the group reduced the intensity of its attacks, and a full-blown war appears less imminent today than maybe it did just a few weeks ago. But as hostilities drag on, the risk of crossing red lines due to an accident, misunderstanding, or miscalculation will continue to increase. Now, even if a ceasefire in Gaza is reached and Hezbollah stops its attacks, launching an offensive in Lebanon will remain a political decision for the Israeli leadership. The recent Hamas attack has likely shifted Israel's risk tolerance, and a return to the status quo of October 6th might be less likely at this point. So Israel might be compelled to try and push Hezbollah beyond the Litani River and to reduce its arsenal. But strong American opposition at this point and a war-weary Israel wanting to allow evacuated citizens to return home and to give its soldiers a break means that the timing of this offensive may not be immediate. Netanyahu's political survival and domestic political calculations, however, remain wildcards. And with that, I'll hand you over to my colleague, Luca Nevola, who will discuss the developments in the Red Sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Mene, for the brilliant overview. So I'll now move the focus of the discussion to Yemen, the Red Sea, and the Houthi movement. So in the wake of October 7th, the Houthis, or Ansarullah, have positioned themselves as the self-proclaimed champions of the Palestinian cause, holding global trade at bay with targeted attacks in the Red Sea. Their stated aim is to impose an embargo on Israel and halt military operations in Gaza, and yet to fully understand the motives and political relevance of their activity in the Red Sea, we must take a step back and analyze the domestic situation in Yemen prior to October 7th. So as you can see from this visual, on the eve of the Gaza conflict in September 2023, the war in Yemen had transitioned into a low-intensity conflict with a significant decrease in the number of events and fatalities. Political violence further decreased during the Red Sea crisis and remains until now on the lowest level recorded by ACLED since the beginning of the war in Yemen. This decrease in frontline activity allowed and is still allowing the Houthis to shift their resources towards the Red Sea. Secondly, in September 2023, the Houthis, who rule the northwest of Yemen over around 70% of the population, were facing a difficult situation, facing mounting internal dissent and a deteriorating economic situation. So the conflict in Gaza diverted popular attention from internal economic problems and garnered significant domestic consensus for the Houthis. This is undoubtedly proven by the massive demonstrations recorded by ACLED since October 2023 in support of Palestine and organized by the Houthis. But this consensus has been translated also into a driver of recruitment for the Houthis, thereby consolidating their military grip over northern Yemen. Now, beyond the domestic scenario, Houthi operations in the Red Sea have been effective in disrupting global trade and have projected the group as an influential regional power. This despite the low lethality of the attacks and the low percentage of hits on the ships. Indeed, confrontations in the Red Sea are asymmetric, and key to the Houthi strategy is the notion of risk, with the threat of potential attacks being sufficient to jeopardize trade flows through the Red Sea. Now, the second visual demonstrates how Houthi activity in the Red Sea evolved through 5 different phases, characterized by a continued, gradual, and controlled escalation, with the perception of risk being created and reinforced by several elements. The first element is a gradual expansion of the areas of the operations. So the geographical pattern of the attacks evolved from October 19th, the start of Houthi operations, until present, with an expansion from northern Red Sea to the southern Red Sea, the Strait of Bab al-Mandeb, then the Gulf of Aden from January, and the more recent claims of attacks in the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. The second element is an expansion of the military objectives. So the initial drone and missile attacks on Israel in phase 1 were ineffective, almost symbolic messages. Therefore, the Houthis expanded the operations to target Israeli-linked vessels in phase 2, and then all vessels headed to Israel in phase 3. And then US and UK interests in phase 4, and now vessels in the Mediterranean. The third element is symbolic responses to regional and international political developments. And the fourth and fifth elements are the release and deployment of new weapons and the coordination with other regional actors. Now, these two last elements are especially evident in phase 5, which is the current phase characterized by 2 main factors. Firstly, unprecedented Houthi escalation, and secondly, a comprehensive strategy implemented by the US-led coalition and the Yemen internationally recognized government to isolate the Houthis and corner them. This strategy includes an increase in the frequency of US airstrikes on Yemen and various forms of economic pressure being enforced on the Houthis. On their end, the Houthis are reacting with several escalatory tactics, an increase in the number of operations with a spike of drone boat attacks and heightened effectiveness, a claimed expansion towards the Mediterranean Sea, which anyways is unverified by ACLED, unprecedented joint operations with the Islamic resistance in Iraq, and the deployment of new weapons, such as the Tufan bomb-laden boat or the Hadim-2 hypersonic missile. Critically, this escalation is also accompanied by a concerning Houthi crackdown on international and local NGOs in Yemen. Now, moving to the international actors involved in the crisis, US and UK airstrikes on Yemen, represented in Visual 3, are part of Operation Poseidon Archer. These airstrikes followed a tit-for-tat retaliatory pattern, paralleling Houthi attacks in the Red Sea and vice versa. Airstrikes can be categorized in 2 types. Between January and June, we recorded around 5 main rounds of airstrikes on strategic infrastructure, which you can see in light blue on the graph. But the majority of the strikes were actually preemptive strikes on missiles and drones already ready to be launched. And those are in gray in the visual. Now, related to these, in June, we are recording a new pattern with more frequent strikes on strategic infrastructure, thus signaling a shift in US strategy. Now, Visual 4 represents the geographical distribution of the airstrikes. The next, yes. Notably, around 80% of the locations targeted by US strikes coincide with those bombed by the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen since 2015, with the additional ones being located around Sana'a, Taiz, and especially on the west coast. Operation Poseidon Archer involved the highest number of US airstrikes recorded by ACLED since 2018 in the Middle East, when Washington was engaged in the war against the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. And yet, the airstrikes have had a limited impact on degrading Houthi military capacity. Now, to wrap up, what are the implications of these trends for the future of the conflict in Yemen and in the broader region? Houthi activity in the Red Sea cannot continue at these levels indefinitely. In fact, escalatory tactics have inherent limits unless new red lines are crossed to expand military targets and areas of operation. This said, an all-out war between Hezbollah and Israel would provide a justification for renewed operations to the Houthis. However, overall, with operations in Gaza winding down, it is plausible that the Houthis will try to capitalize on the current situation with 2 major aims. consolidating the internal front, repressing dissent and mobilizing their fighters, and projecting their power externally, strengthening their coordination with the axis of resistance. As a consequence, the Houthi leadership appears to be less and less interested in international legitimacy granted by Western actors. At the same time, the US now considers the Houthis as a long-term threat. However, they lack powerful leverage to constrain their activity. Washington's ability to degrade Houthi military capabilities has proven to be quite limited, with Houthi attacks continuing and increasing. Therefore, in the short term, Washington have just a few options in their hands, either increasing economic sanctions, waiving the threat of an FTO designation, pressuring Saudi Arabia to stall peace talks, or granting support to local actors in Yemen to consolidate the front lines and mitigate the risk of a Houthi advance. Overall, a comprehensive political solution seems far from being achievable in the midterm, casting a shadow on future peace efforts. And with this, I thank you, and I'll leave the floor to my colleague, Kieran Doyle, addressing global protest movement and US protests. Thank you.
Thank you, Luca. Hello, everyone. My name is Kieran Doyle, and I am the North America Research Manager here at ACLED. On our first slide here, you can see a highlight of the work done by my team, as well as many colleagues across ACLED. As you may know, ACLED tracks not only political violence, but also political protests and demonstrations across the world. And this map helps to showcase the global protest movement, showing support and solidarity for Palestine and Palestinians since the beginning of the war. We've highlighted the countries that have seen the 5 highest numbers of demonstration events since the beginning of the war, which you can see on the map. Yemen has had the highest number of demonstrations, highlighting some of the dynamics that Luca was talking about, while the United States has seen second most. But as you can see on the map, there's also demonstrations throughout Europe, through East and South Asia, in Australia, and scattered across Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. So we're going to turn now to the data that I handle, which is the United States data. And with that, to the next slide, please. So you can now get a more granular picture of the demonstration movements since the beginning of the war in the United States. It might jump out at you immediately that there is quite a concentration of demonstrations on the East Coast, and indeed the top 3 states in terms of the number of demonstration events they have seen are New York, California, and Massachusetts. However, we recorded demonstration events in all 50 states since the beginning of the war, as well as in Washington, D.C. Within the ACLED data, we also record these demonstration events at the county and city level. And looking at that aspect of the data, a couple of things become clear. Notably, some particular counties, notably Hennepin County in Minnesota and Wayne County in Michigan, have a very high number of demonstration events relative to the rest of their state. This kind of granularity allows us to perceive some of the ways in which these demonstration movements reflect ongoing political dynamics in the United States in the 2024 election cycle. And I can discuss that a little bit more on the next slide. So in both of the states that I just highlighted, in Michigan and in Minnesota, the Democratic primary elections held earlier this year saw a large number of protest votes in which people voted uncommitted in the Democratic primary. And this was clear in our data from before these primaries took place, that these areas had a very high level of pro-Palestine demonstrations. ACLED data helps provide this kind of insight into how demonstration movements can be reflective of larger political movements in general. We've also been tracking pro-Palestine demonstrations on university campuses across the United States. And our data on that has been highlighted in publications such as The Guardian, as we have found that a very high percentage of those demonstrations have not seen any violence. This article is from a month ago, maybe a month and a bit. And that number still remains true with our latest data. These university campus demonstrations are important to highlight because in recent months, they have represented a large percentage of the overall pro-Palestine demonstration movement in the United States. And to help you visualize that, we have a nice graph on the next slide. So you can see here the course of the pro-Palestine demonstration movement in the United States since the beginning of the war. And as you can see, there is a massive spike in demonstrations beginning in late April and continuing in May and into early June. And this is largely as a result of encampment-style demonstrations on university campuses across the country, beginning, of course, with the encampment at the University of Columbia in New York. These encampment-style demonstrations began to crop up more and more, especially after the police response to the demonstrations in Colombia. This, I hope, gives you some idea of how ACLED data can help to visualize the demonstration movement response to the global the war, and how that can have global reverberations. ACLED demonstration data also helps to capture other kinds of demonstration drivers. For example, in the United States, we track demonstrations related to abortion, gun rights, environmental movements, and many other drivers. And this demonstration data, again, helps to reflect what else is going on in the political climate. This issue, pro-Palestine demonstrations, has proven to be especially salient in the current 2024 election cycle, and it's something that we will continue to monitor closely going forward. With that, I will pass the presentation off back to Klina to talk about violent Islamist movements. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Brilliant. Actually, if I can start with the next slide, please. So firstly, I'm going to say that I'm focused much more particularly on jihadi movements across Africa. There has been a great concern that jihadi movements are relocating to Africa and embedding themselves within those countries for a variety of reasons. But in one sense, it's because it is fertile ground to maybe regain some of the lost territory and lost influence that they have struggled with in the last decade or so, as jihadi movements have faced a general decline. And the moment, of course, of October 7th provided an interesting opportunity for them to seize. But as it is certainly accurate that jihadi movements have embedded themselves within African states. In fact, what we find is that although there are relatively few rebel or insurgent groups within African states, they take up a tremendous number of the events that occur within the countries. And what's more, they are typically of some sort of violent Islamist perspective, not exclusively by any means, but often they certainly are. But what I will say is that Gaza has not proved a justification for an increase in their behavior as it has in some of the other contexts we've seen recently. And that's in part because, as I mentioned earlier, the relationship of African countries, either to the Palestinian cause, to Israel, and even to the US, is much more complicated than in some of the other cases where there have been direct or indirect through alliance relationships that can be that could be affected by, of course, what was happening within Gaza between Israel and Hamas. And so what we can see here is that I have from January 2022 through last week, there's a general, I would say, stability in the pattern of disorder across African states. You might see, of course, this spike here. But if we go to the next slide, this spike looks to be, of course, around the period of October 7th when we mentioned. But here, if we look at African countries with openly violent Islamist movements, and you'll notice here, and I want to be very clear, that not all the violence you're seeing on the map of African countries is Islamist in nature. And in fact, some of that violence, especially, of course, in the Nigeria's northeast, is not apparent here. But it doesn't change the perspective of the webinar information, is that there is generally a decline in that kind of activity rather than an increase. And as prolific as these groups are, and as much as they are in fact responsible for quite a significant amount of violence that's occurring within African countries, they are generally on the decline. Now, they have not been able to take advantage of the Gaza conflict, in part because of very particular domestic issues, which I'm hoping to go over before turning to Q&A. So generally, African Islamist groups tend to be national in nature. There, of course, especially in the Sahel, are those with an international focus, but they actually don't tend to be as successful as groups like Al-Shabaab that are highly focused on national objectives. What we often find with groups that are in a state of decline is that they'll try alternative measures like social engineering. And we're seeing, in fact, increased levels of social engineering, such as increased use of Islamist legal precedents or attempts to go out to rural areas and to teach from the Quran. And those alternative measures are in the rise of some places in Mozambique and others. There is a tremendous amount of intra-competition. And what I mean by this is that, for example, in the Sahel, a significant, if not in sometimes a dominant focus of both JNIM and ISGS, the dominant groups representing an Al-Qaeda affiliate and an IS affiliate in the Sahel, is really against each other. They are focused on fighting each other more so than focused on fighting the regional governments in which they are positioned. A tremendous amount of internal jihadi competition within these contexts. And what's more, when it's not internal competition, it's often competition with the many, many other armed groups within the region. So they are not responding to the Gaza conflict in part because they are engulfed with the conflicts that are happening extremely locally and, of course, generally domestically within that context. So I would say that when we're thinking about why jihadism has managed to take off within African countries and why it's on the decline, we need to be looking at how they're able to react to local opportunities rather than international struggles. And as I mentioned, jihad as a violent organizing principle has declined more generally within African states. And there was an excellent report recently about its decline specifically within Libya. And what came out of that discussion was that the brand jihadism that was so popular over the last 2 decades or so has declined in part because, one, it offered opportunities for alliances that it no longer does. And that's in part related to the fact that these global movements, especially AQ and IS, and especially IS, are associated with such incredible rates of violence, both against Muslims and, of course, against non-Muslims, that they effectively became incapable, or rather, they became outside of what was allowed in most violent environments. They were simply too big of a risk, especially because it tended to attract outside activity or outside interest. And the branding of this particular struggle is no longer particularly attractive, especially when there are others, such as domestic politics or even nationalism, as we previously discussed, that can be much more relevant and allow for a lot more support and recruitment. And one of the things that I should mention also is that military attacks on Islamist violent groups have been generally successful, especially when it's based on air attacks. And I think that's what we'll see continuing within contexts such as Nigeria. So as we're able to show, different contexts really responded to the Gaza conflict in very different ways, largely related to the relationship that these countries or their affiliates or their alliances had with Israel and the US, less so with the support for Hamas or Palestinian statehood, as Kieran was able to show, of course. A claim of a pro-Palestinian movement is a lot different than knowing about the process of getting a Palestinian state and how you're able to wield domestic levers to get that to happen. But I'm going to stop now because we have 10 more minutes, and I would really love to take everybody's questions. I'm going to look specifically at some of the questions that are already here, because a few of them had come in I thought were excellent. To Jeff Selden, I will get to that message. And I would like Amina for you to answer the first one from Mila. In parallel to the increase of targeting of civilians by settlers in the West Bank, has the targeting of humanitarian organizations, both local and international, also increased? Thank you for your question, Mila.
Yes, thank you. I won't have now a number off the top of my head, but yes, there has been a number of attacks on aid convoys that were transporting aid to Gaza, and we have had settlers blocking but also attacking these convoys. We have also had many attacks, for example, attacking Israeli activists in the West Bank, who at times are accompanying Palestinians, for example, Palestinian shepherds, to make sure they are not attacked or to make sure that they can document the violence. And they have also been increasingly attacked. So a broad yes, but for me to now get you a specific number, or you can do it yourself looking at the data, we will have this information included in our data. But yes, there have been many attacks.
Thank you so much, Amina. There is a question, I think, for Luca. How can we imagine the practice of cooperation between the Houthis and the Islamic resistance in Iraq? Do they only share information, or do they both carry out attacks together? What are the advantages of Houthis to cooperate with the Islamic resistance of Iraq besides the association with the axis of resistance? So that seems like a lot to address, so I'll leave that to you.
Yes, thank you for the question. Well, firstly, I'd like to state that since the beginning of the Gaza crisis, members of the Axis of Resistance have identified Yemen and Iraq as the launchpad for attacks against Israel. And this was mostly to reduce the risk of a regional escalation associated with a potential retaliation from Hezbollah and with a conflict that could erupt between Hezbollah and Israel itself. Why the Houthis are cooperating with members of the Islamic resistance? Well, firstly, they are cooperating. During June, a number of joint attacks have been carried out together by the Houthis and Kataib Hezbollah. This is pretty natural in the way that relationships between the Houthi elite network and the elite network of the Shiite militias in Iraq evolved. Since before the start of the war in Yemen, there are very strong connections between the Houthi leadership and members of the Islamic resistance in Iraq, although it was not called like that before. And on the other hand, the relationship with Hezbollah is continuous, of course, but it's more under the radar. It's not as official as the one with the local militias in Iraq. And the meaning of this cooperation, in my opinion, is mainly a symbolic meaning. The Houthis want to stress their orientation towards the axis of resistance, and perhaps they also have regional ambitions, and so they want to strengthen their reputation towards the members of the axis of resistance. But in operational terms, there's no added value when they conduct these joint operations as of now. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Nasser, Mahande asks, what impact has internal demonstrations in Israel had on attacks by Hamas operations? Would you like to take that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think, Hamas actually considering the disorder in Israel in its calculation for continuing the operation. And if you just keep following what Hamas publishing, you can see that Hamas is trying also to motivate the disorder and the demonstrations by circulating ongoing videos about the abductees. Also, I think part of the decision-making calculation for Hamas leadership, thinking that making or reaching, seeing a disorder inside Israel is giving them an opportunity to continue their operation and also to achieve their goal of their survival inside Gaza and going back to the status quo that has been before October 6 or October 7, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Kieran. Do you have a forecast? I would imagine this is your own forecast for pro-Palestinian demonstrations at either of the party conventions in Milwaukee or Chicago? That's from Michael. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Yes, I mean, I think you can expect there to be protests at both of them. We've seen protests outside of the debate that recently happened. To what extent that will take place, in the lead up to the convention versus, on the day of, during the convention, I think is harder to predict. It's also, we're in a bit of a transition phase for the pro-Palestine demonstration movement as a whole in the United States. As you saw on the graph earlier, there's been a decline recently, mostly as universities end their academic terms and many of the students participating in the encampments have gone home. So while I think most major domestic political events in the lead up to the election will see some kind of a protest, it's not clear how widespread or how large those will be. And I think that may depend on what might happen when university sessions resume later in the year. And of course, what happens in terms of the war and the United States' outlook towards the war in general.
Wonderful,
Thanks.
thank you. Thanks very much. There's a question about how likely the Houthis are to expand their operations to the Horn of Africa. I'm going to say unlikely, but I'm going to ask Luca to confirm or refute that.
It's unlikely, of course, but miscalculations can always happen. We have recorded in the month of June several missiles accidentally landing in Eritrea, for instance, and Djibouti, while trying to target ships in the Red Sea. So intentionally, probably it's very unlikely to happen, but incidents can always happen.
That's all the region needs. Okay, I do want to mention, thank you very much for that, Luca, that there are some other questions here, especially relating to Houthis and trading routes. And I want to take this time to especially note that we have a Yemen conflict observatory in which many of these questions are addressed. There's also regular reports and specific data and dashboards relating to these concepts. So please do take the opportunity to check those out. There's been a number of different notes here, especially regarding the previous documentation and the reports that have been put together by the Middle East team more broadly, and AMNA especially, on the West Bank, settler violence, etc. Please do take the opportunity, of course, to look those through. And also to note, not only the US Crisis Monitor, which has been following many of these trends, especially obviously within the US, but the data for everything we've discussed here is available for everybody to access and download, should they wish to look at this themselves. We also have an exploratory tool so that you can make your own graphs, etc., with what you've seen here. This webinar will be available, I believe, on YouTube, but I am getting that confirmed. But it will be available for all to look at. We really appreciate your time and patience today with us doing our all around the houses discussion about the reverberations from Gaza. As you can see, they're quite serious and ongoing, and in some ways quite distinct from the actual activity in Gaza. So that will give us a great amount of conflict patterns to continue to observe and to relate to you. And thank you very much for your time. And we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you. And again, to the participants, it was excellent. Thank you.